NASA in the 1960s were in full swing, developing mission after mission with the goal of going to the moon by 1970. Apollo 1 would be the first ever crewed mission of the new Apollo spacecraft, the first in a series that would lead to Apollo 11 and Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. But they were behind schedule. Concerns about constant delays had been raised by NASA to the company making the Apollo capsule at the time, North American Aviation. These concerns grew to such an extent that by the time the module was delivered to NASA, 113 significant engineering orders had yet to be finished. Then more problems were found with the module, one of the most major being a short in the radio command system. By January 26, 1967, the spacecraft had finally been mated with the command module. The previous plugged-in test had gone well, and so the order to go for the plugged-out version was given. This test wasn't considered hazardous by NASA. It didn't involve fuel, high pressure, or any of the usual suspects when it came to risk in spaceflight. So just like many of the other tests, preparations were made for just another ordinary day at Launch Complex 34. The crew that day were some of the strongest astronauts NASA had to offer. Gus Grissom, hailing from the small town of Mitchell, Indiana, was an engineer and test pilot in the US Air Force. He was also the second American to fly into space in 1961, and was chosen to be the commander of the upcoming Apollo 1 mission. He would be accompanied by Ed White and Roger Chaffee. Chaffee was a Navy pilot who had won an air medal for the imaging of Cuba during the missile crisis. He was one of 13 pilots selected to be an astronaut in 1963, and this was going to be his first time in space. White, on the other hand, had been to space before, as a part of the Gemini 4 mission. Graduating from West Point in 1952, he was selected to fly the F-86 Sabre and F-100 Super Sabre during his time stationed in West Germany. On the 3rd of June 1965, he also became the first American to walk in space, and as a result, he was now appointed to be the senior pilot for the upcoming mission. As far as testing goes, the plugged-out test planned for that day would be simple. On the day before, several staff from NASA and North American Aviation met to discuss it, and check the Apollo module to make sure it was ready. They all came to the same conclusion. It was good to go. On the 27th, a simulated countdown would be conducted. The men would be inside and fully suited. They would stay inside for several hours, conducting operations as though it were a real launch. At 1 PM on the 27th, Grissom, White and Chaffee climbed into Apollo 1. But there was a problem. When Grissom connected his oxygen supply to the modules, it led to a sour smell inside his suit, similar to buttermilk. A sample of air was taken, but then the test continued. A weird smell wasn't going to be enough to stop it. The next problem rose its head almost immediately afterwards. The master alarm had triggered, indicating high oxygen flow. At the time, this was thought to be the result of the trio moving around inside the module, and a solution was never really found. But this was considered not a big problem, and so the test continued. As if two issues weren't bad enough, a third, more serious issue occurred not long after. Communication problems. First between the control room and Grissom, and then between the control room and operations. It got to the point where Clarence Chauvin, one of the NASA men working on the test that day, stated, "The overall communications were so bad at times that we could not even understand what the crew were saying." This issue was seen as serious enough that the countdown had to be held at 5:40 PM. It would be roughly another hour before the operations room was ready to restart the count. But at that point, the worst issue of all was just about to occur. The oxygen inside the module had rose once again. Someone, probably Grissom, inside the module had moved. But barely 4 seconds after this, Chaffee stated, "Fire, I smell fire." It was the first sign that something was seriously wrong. The alarmed voices were enough to cause the engineers to look up at the television that was focused on the spacecraft. But they saw nothing. The view was almost completely obscured by smoke, with the only image of flames lapping around inside being capable of poking through. Then a gut-wrenching half-scream filled the air. For 5 minutes, the men at the tower battled intense heat and dense smoke just to be able to open the hatch, eventually succeeding. But it was way too late. The 3 men were dead. A medical autopsy showed that the men had died from asphyxiation, with burns being a contributing factor. However, the injuries weren't limited to the 3 men inside. 27 others on the ground were treated for smoke inhalation, with a further 2 needing hospitalization. With the cause of the incident being somewhat unclear, and the outrage over the death of the 3 men reaching an incredible height, the entire moon mission now hung in the balance, following the first deaths in US spaceflight history. The fire had torn through the module at an incredible pace. But what had actually happened? In the aftermath, a review board was created. Debris from inside the module was slowly removed piece by piece, and a reconstruction of the capsule and the events of that day were made. In the end, the investigation showed that the fire had started from one of the wire bundles on the left side of the capsule. It was just in front of where Grissom was seated, in a spot barely visible to Roger Chaffee. The crew probably didn't even notice the fire for the first 5 or 6 seconds after ignition. Then it ripped through the oxygen-filled cabin at an extremely rapid pace. The exact source would never be fully determined. The extent of the damage and the speed at which the accident happened made piecing the chain of events together incredibly difficult. In the end, the statement from astronaut Frank Borman summed it up best. Everyone had taken for granted the safety and ground testing. The strong reaction from both the United States Congress and the public as a whole led to some significant changes within NASA and to the Apollo project going forward. The report mentioned numerous design flaws with the Apollo module, bad workmanship, and even quality control. This led to a redesigned hatch being one of the first priorities for the new module. It would now be a single-door hatch, replacing the previously complex 3-layer door. This new hatch could be opened with just half a pound of force. In addition to this, the nylon that the spacesuits had been made out of was changed to a more flame-retardant material, known as beta cloth. The exposed wire bundles that were thought to be the most likely cause of the fire would now be coated and rerouted to lower the chances of contact with each other, and to improve the flame protection overall. Finally, the composition of air inside the Apollo module would be changed, from one of pure oxygen to a mixture of 60% oxygen and 40% nitrogen, at least during pre-launch, while in orbit, they would use a lower level of pressure for the cabin overall. Like all accidents, important and valuable information in regards to safety was learned, but it came at a terrible price. The most important change, though, was the culture. In the aftermath, Gene Kranz, the then chief flight director, called a meeting of his staff at Mission Control and made a powerful speech, stating, "We were too gung-ho about the schedule, and we blocked out all of the problems we saw each day in our work. Every element of the program was in trouble, and so were we." He went on to say about how their role was to be tough and competent, and to require nothing less than perfection. This speech would go on to be one of NASA's principles. It was hoped that these points would never need to be retold again at a later tragedy. Unfortunately, the same cultural issues that contributed to the Apollo 1 disaster repeated themselves during the rush to launch the shuttle Columbia years later, where iteration of Kranz's speech was once again needed. In the end, the US would eventually make it to the moon on Apollo 11. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins would conclude the mission that Grissom, White, and Chaffee had begun all those years before. An Apollo 1 patch was left on the moon by Armstrong and Aldrin. The majority of the Apollo 1 module was never put on public display, the only exception being the hatch. This was displayed at the Saturn V rocket display at Kennedy Space Center. It stands as a testament to the risks involved in space travel, even when you're firmly attached to the ground. If you enjoyed this video, here's another, involving another crew. This time, they made it to space, but unfortunately, never made it back.